Good morning. Today we are going to talk about Toys by Roland Barthes. Before we move into the text, we'll quickly have a look at Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes was, as you know, was a French literary theorist, essayist, philosopher, critic, and semiotician. And he has contributed much to the theories of structuralism, semiotics, and post-structuralism. He started his career using structuralism as a means to defend his arguments against existentialism. And then he moved into semiotics when he got interested into Saussures' ideas of sign. And later he moved into post-structuralism and he got inspired by Derrida's idea of deconstruction. One of the post-structuralist texts for which he is known is Death of the Author. In Death of the Author, he talks about how the idea of author becomes dead once the text becomes published, once the work becomes published. He says that the reader becomes the co-author there, and the author does not have any other say once it is published. His other major works include S bar Z, From Work to Text. In this essay, he distinguishes between work and text. He says that anything around us can be considered as a text if there can be given an interpretation. But work is different. Once the text is printed, it's published. When it attains a concrete form, it becomes a work. But before that, any matter which is subject to interpretation can be called as a text. Mythologies is another of his famous works. Now, this essay that we have to study is taken from Mythologies. This book was published in 1957. Here he looks at how the social value systems create modern myths, and he bases every one of his myths on the French society. The New Yorker has reported or has reviewed Mythologies, saying that Barthes offers strangely simplistic accusations of what Marx calls the false consciousness. And he says that it is not a person, but it's a class. And it is the bourgeois class that he refers to often here. So in Mythologies, what Barthes does is he looks at certain constructed myths in the French culture, in the French society, and then he talks about how all these systems, all these cultural myths are actually created by the bourgeois society in order to propagate certain ideologies that they believed in. So the methodology that he uses in Mythologies is it's based on Saussures' concept of sign. He improves on Saussures' concept of sign and elevates it to a second level, where he transforms the myth itself as a sign. This book is divided into two sections, Mythologies and Myth Today. And in part 1, Mythologies, there is a list of French cultural icons or French cultural aspects that he has taken for study. He has chosen this for their status as modern myths and for the added meaning that has been conferred upon them. So each short chapter in the first part of the book deals with one such myth. For example, one of the chapters talks about Einstein's brain. Another chapter talks about the advertisements of soap powders and detergents. Another one talks about the French wine. He talks about how French wine has assumed so much of importance in the French society because it was something propagated by the bourgeois middle class, which later became the ruling class. Similarly, the French toys. He talks about the wrestling itself as a spectacle. He talks of the Romans in films. He talks of striptease. All those French cultural phenomena he chooses and tries to reinterpret them using the theory of semiotics. Now, coming to part 2, the second part of the book, which is titled Myth Today. Here he justifies his choices of myths and the analysis he has given to them. So basically, as we said earlier, he has based his methodology on Saussure's concept of sign. Sign, according to Saussure, is a combination of signifier and the signified. Now here he elevates it to a secondary level, the next level, and he says that myth itself is a sign with its root in language. So the equation changes from sign is equal to signifier plus signified to myth is equal to sign, which itself becomes a signifier, and a new meaning which becomes a signified. So myth is equal to sign. That's what he's trying to argue through this text. And he comes to a conclusion that myths are propagated with the agenda of promoting the ruling class and its media. Now, coming to the essay under consideration, that is toys. Here Barthes starts the essay by talking about the French toys. He says that the French toys, if you look at the French toys, they suggest about the adult's attitude towards these children. He says that the French adult looks at a child as yet another miniature version of adult. So the toys that they provide them are also a microcosm of the adult world. So French toys, he says that the French toys always mean something, and to quote him, he says that it is entirely socialized and it is constituted by the myths or the techniques of modern adult life. So he says that each of these French toys are meant to prepare the child to take up adult roles. So the French toys are always a representation of the adult world. It is a miniature version of the adult world, and they are prescripted signifiers. Each of the toy is meant to prepare the child for something. For example, he gives this example of a girl who is given the toy of a baby doll. The baby doll can be fed, so the child feeds the baby doll. The milk turns into water in the stomach of the baby doll, and then it urinates. So the child is taught how to change the nappies of this baby doll. So that's a way of preparing the girl child to take up the role of the motherhood in the later life. Similarly, for the boys also, he says that the kind of toys that they are given, for example, the guns, the Vespa scooters, the cars, the army men, toys of the army men, all these are things that the child does not find, as he becomes, would not find unusual in the world he lives. So it is to prepare the child for war, for bureaucracy, for ugliness, for Martians, to prepare the child for the adult world. That's what the French toys are basically intended for, he says. So that's what he calls the conditioning of the child for the adult world. He compares the French toys to a Givaro head. As you see the image, Givaro heads are shrunken heads. Those are the heads separated from the human body, and they are dried and shrunken to this size so that they can preserve it. So French toys, he calls them as Givaro heads. They are the miniature versions of the already existing reality of the society, and these are given to the children to enable them to accept the realities of life when they grow up. So he says that the French toys are so realistic in nature that the child itself might find it difficult, might find it easy as he grows up. He would feel accustomed to all those things from childhood itself. Then he moves on to talk about the invented forms and ready-made toys. He says most of the French toys these days are ready-made in nature. There is no scope that is given to a child for creativity. So a child who is given a gun has nothing to experiment with it other than play with a gun, or a child who is given a car has nothing else to experiment with that car except to play with it. So the child becomes a user. French toys are designed to make children users and not creators. He appreciates the building blocks actually, and he says that building blocks they discover the creativity in children so fast. Um, a child being given a set of blocks would start inventing new things, start building different forms, gives its own version of explanations to it, starts giving its own name, which gives the child a lot of scope for creativity. So the child, he says that the French toys need to be replaced with the building blocks. Or the children should be given space for creativity when they are given toys, he says. And then he moves on to the next main argument in the essay, where he talks about the French toys being plastic, being chemically produced. He seems to have a lot of appreciation for the wooden toys. He says that the wooden toys remain with the child as he or she grows up, but the plastic toys, they are so fragile, they are so temporary in nature that it wears off, it gets lost in the course of time, it gets destroyed in the course of time. So he says that the plastic that is used to create the substance with which the toys are made also matter. So plastic needs to be replaced, he says. The plastic toys are something which the child, which would not give a human aspect to the toys. So he says the wood actually replaces that, gives that human aspect, because wood itself is made from a living being. So that chemical nature of the toys are also harmful for children, he says. So basically, to conclude, he comes he rounds off his argument saying that the French toys are again one representation of the bourgeois society, whereby they prepare the child for the realities of the world, without giving scope for creativity, without giving scope for discovery, for invention. The child is just made a user, and even as the child grows up, he just uses things, he just gets accustomed to using things rather than creating. So that's the first aspect which he tries to project. The second one is with regard to creation and using. He says that the invented forms are always, or the building blocks are always better than the ready-made toys. And then he moves on to say that the plastic, the material that is used to create the toys also matter. Plastic has no human nature, whereas wood has more human touch to it, because it is also made from a living thing. Plastic is more chemical in nature, so that can only harm the child. So that's how he concludes the essay. Thank you.